So welcome, everyone. I am delighted that you've joined us for today's MTI Research Snaps webinar, Collaborative Strategies for Sustainable Transportation, Developing an Equitable VMT Mitigation Program for Santa Clara County. My name is Dr. Hillary Nixon, and I am Deputy Executive Director of the Mineta Transportation Institute at San José State University. MTI is a university transportation center funded by the U.S. Department of Transportation that leads 4 competitively selected multi-university consortia focused on improving the mobility of people and goods. MTI's mission is to increase mobility for all by improving the safety, efficiency, accessibility, and convenience of our nation's transportation system. We accomplish this through surface transportation research, technology transfer, education, and workforce development. In today's webinar, we are discussing the efforts led by the Santa Clara Valley Transportation Authority with support from MTI and San José State University students to develop an equitable program to reduce driving generated from new developments. Our speaker today is Dr. Serena Alexander, an MTI research associate and associate professor of public policy and environmental engineering at Northeastern University. Her research focuses on developing, implementing, and evaluating cutting-edge strategies to address climate change and the environmental and equity impacts of transportation. During the webinar, if you have any questions for our presenter, you can submit them through the chat or Q&A feature. We are recording this webinar, and the link to view will be available shortly on our website and social media pages. Now, I want to pass the mic over to Robert Zwerk from VTA, who has been such an integral part of this collaboration. Robert.
Thank you, Dr. Nixon. Again, my name is Robert Zwerk, and I'm a Principal Transportation Planner at VTA, Santa Clara Valley Transportation Authority, the county-wide transportation agency for the San Jose Silicon Valley area here in California. And I'm the project manager for the overall VTA planning effort that Dr. Nixon mentioned, looking at just ways to reduce the amount of driving from new development, potentially establishing a new county-wide program, reducing VMT with an equity emphasis. And I just want to briefly acknowledge Caltrans, the State Department of Transportation here, for providing grant funding that largely is funding VTA's overall efforts, as well as the work of San Jose State Mineta Transportation Institute on this project. So thank you, Caltrans. I want to thank San Jose State Mineta for their efforts, particularly Dr. Alexander, Dr. Nixon, the students, and the research team involved. I want to briefly acknowledge a couple of VTA colleagues who are on the call with me here, Ian Lynn and Deanna Bolio, who have been really instrumental in helping this project get where we are at this point. And just briefly mention that we are already working on incorporating some of the findings and recommendations of this work that you're going to hear about shortly into our own overall project this evening. And also on Thursday, we are hosting in-person community engagement workshops, and we are incorporating some of the recommendations of the San Jose State Mineta team into these workshops. So with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Serena Alexander. Thanks.
Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. And thank you for the introduction, the VTA team and Dr. Nixon. So let's get started. In 2013, California's Senate Bill 743 brought a significant change to California's Environmental Quality Act, or CEQA, by establishing vehicle miles traveled, or VMT, as the transportation impact measure to promote the state's climate goals. While this shift away from level of service, which was essentially a measure of traffic, to VMT much better aligns with the state's climate policy goals, it also introduced several implementation challenges. One concern was the potentially unintended inequitable effects of VMT mitigation. To reduce driving, we have to think regionally. What happens if VMT mitigation investments, such as public transit improvements or measures to enhance walkability, are implemented far away from developments with the potential to increase VMT? How do we ensure that disadvantaged communities fully benefit from VMT mitigation investments? Because these questions are very important, VTA received a grant from Caltrans to develop a program that puts equity at the Center of VMT Mitigation in Santa Clara County. This report was the result of coordinated efforts between the VTA project team, Dr. Hillary Nixon, students from the fall 2023 cohort of the San José State University Urban Planning Policy Analysis course, and myself. Here you can see the names of individuals who contributed to this project. If you scan the QR code, it will take you to the report page. We'll come back to this at the end of the presentation. So if you miss here, that's no problem at all. So the students conducted a variety of kinds of research, conducting a literature review, a spatial analysis, community engagement observations, and interviews with stakeholders and community members. Building upon student findings and preliminary recommendations, the MTI team developed a refined set of policy recommendations for the VTA project team to consider. The literature review focused on identifying best practices and strategies for incorporating equity into program design and frameworks. Because this is a growing body of literature, we studied 23 pieces of literature, including 5 planning documents and 18 research articles. These included articles that focused specifically on VMT mitigation, and also some related to other relevant program types, such as environmental resources or wetland mitigation. We wanted to see how off-site environmental mitigation considers dimensions of equity. Our spatial analysis focused on identifying other areas in addition to MTC EPCs to consider for community engagement, both in VTA's current project and project prioritization in the future. We completed an in-depth spatial analysis of inequities and burdens by using ArcGIS Pro to map addition indices of inequity, including AB 1550 to focus on low-income communities, SP 535 to focus on pollution burden, the HPI to focus on health equity, the Caltrans EQI to focus on transportation impacts, and the Federal Justice 40 tool that also focuses on transportation impacts. A total of 10 maps were created as a part of this process. The map displayed here shows different equity indices overlapped to highlight areas that are categorized as disadvantaged or burdened according to multiple dimensions of inequity. The students working on community engagement first reviewed literature to identify best practices for an equitable community engagement approach. They identified 5 best practices for equitable community engagement. These focused on a multi-channel communication approach, a clear and accessible language, surveys and focus groups to ensure that a lot of data is collected, public meetings, as well as leveraging social media. Students then attended 5 Phase 1 community engagement events between the months of September and November 2023 to observe the VTA project team's community engagement approach and completed an assessment based on the 5 best practices. Events attended included 3 in-person tabling events, an online virtual community meeting focused on gathering feedback and thoughts from members of the public, and an online focus group session focused on gathering feedback and thoughts from community-based organizations. Using interview guides, 2 student groups also completed a total of 20 interviews, 8 with representatives of community-based organizations. You can see the logos featured on the slide here, as well as 12 with community members. Interview responses yielded more in-depth information on thoughts and feelings towards new developments and developer contributions to VMT mitigation measures, as well as community transportation needs, challenges, and preferences. The research team then consolidated the interview findings from the 2 student groups. So let's focus on the findings from the various parts of the research. First, developing an informative and implementable accountability plan can promote program equity and mitigate concerns about transparency and even misappropriation of funds. The MTI report on safeguarding equity in off-site VMT mitigation that you can access by going to Mineta Transportation Institute's website, as well as the 2022 Berkeley CLEE report on implementing SB 743, have specific recommendations for accountability measures. Embedding equity into the project prioritization criteria and program evaluation metrics were identified as best practices for incorporating equity into the program framework and design. Plans that can be referenced for advancing these strategies include the LA Metro Plan and the Contra Costa County Plan. Students additionally identified the Ventura County Vehicle Miles Travel Adaptation Mitigation Program as an emerging VMT program that VTA can reference in program and framework development. These strategies have the potential to significantly advance equity within the program as they outline strategies for developing the program equity framework. The map here shows equity indices overlap to highlight communities experiencing multiple inequities and burdens. Darker shades generally indicate that an area is identified as an equity community by multiple indices. For instance, neighborhoods in Central and East San Jose, as well as in Gilroy, are consistently identified as equity communities by each of the indices analyzed for this project, so they appear as a deep purple shade. Additional areas identified as equity communities, aside from the MTC EPCs and Alviso, include areas in northern Sunnyvale, Morgan Hill, and the unincorporated area east of Gilroy. The spatial analysis also revealed that some low VMT areas were identified as areas experiencing burdens from pollution and transportation impacts. At the community engagement events, we observed several interesting findings. First, public meetings were handled very well. VTA remained dedicated to making engagement materials and opportunities for community members who spoke other languages. Translations can be seen in the tabling board. Another great example was providing live interpreters for the virtual community meeting one for Spanish, Vietnamese, and Mandarin speakers. VTA also participated in events and festivals in equity priority communities to engage with community members from these areas. Using stickers and notes on the tabling board and having giveaway prizes were great strategies to engage with community members at tabling events. Some suggestions that we had included for VTA to more proactively engage passerby during tabling events, make some adjustments to the tabling boards for improved visibility in outdoor settings and increased understanding for non-technical audiences. VTA can also make further use of social media to reach a broader audience. Interviewees shared thoughts on transportation challenges, new developments, and developer contributions to VMT mitigation measures. In 85% of interviews, a need for improved public transit was voiced. While some interviewees saw new developments as a signal of progress and positive change, there were concerns about increased traffic and harm to existing residents. Many interviewees were aware that new development projects generate traffic and held a negative sentiment toward increased congestion. Many interviewees were also concerned that new developments could result in displacement or impact living costs for existing residents. A majority of interviewees conditionally supported the concept of developer contributions to fund VMT mitigation measures. There were concerns that assessing additional fees could result in higher development costs, which could then be passed on to tenants or could potentially discourage development of housing, and particularly affordable housing, which is very much needed in this area. Some interviewees were concerned about transparency and even misappropriation of funds. We created a recommendation matrix to assess administrative ease, time commitment, and degree of equity contributions. Here we can see some of the key recommendations. First and foremost, developing and adopting a localized definition of VMT equity is very important. This may be somewhat challenging, as the project team will need to develop a definition while faced with competing interests, needs, and priorities of the Santa Clara County population. This is something that can be completed by the end of the plan development phase. This has the potential to improve the equity framework of the program by tailoring equity considerations to local context. The second recommendation was to develop an informative and implementable accountability plan. This may be somewhat challenging to implement, though VTA may be able to build upon strategies used in past plans to develop an accountability plan. This is a long-term commitment, as it will be applied to the project selection process during implementation and potentially in future VMT programs as well. Equity contributions are moderate because an accountability plan does not inherently promote equity. The project team would need to build equity-related criteria into the accountability plan. Another recommendation was to embed equity at key decision-making points. This can be somewhat challenging, especially since VMT mitigation, especially off-site VMT mitigation, is still an emerging practice. The VTA project team will need to identify the right criteria and metrics to ensure equity remains an important element of plan development and implementation. This is a long-term commitment, as project prioritization and evaluation will occur in the implementation phase and in potential future VMT mitigation programs. This strategy directly focused on incorporating equity into plan and program design, so the contributions to equity would be significant. And lastly, it is important to prioritize public transit investments to improve the availability, frequency, reliability, and speed of transit. Community engagement responses showed a tremendous demand for major transit improvements. This is a major investment that will require substantial funding and will require significant changes to public transit infrastructure and services, as well as regional collaboration. Public transit agencies are also grappling with challenges in recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic, such as transit operator shortages and lower fare box recovery. These changes will take many years to come into fruition, and would have to be focused toward equity communities to directly contribute to program equity. An improved public transit system otherwise has the potential for increased access and substantial VMT reduction, which may secondarily contribute to equity. So let's focus on key takeaways and some conclusions. Findings from this study can be used to further support an equitable program framework in several ways. Findings from the spatial analysis and stakeholder interviews provide insight into how the community experiences inequities and what the prominent transportation concerns and needs are. This is important information that should be incorporated into the development of a localized definition of VMT equity, a best practice identified in the literature review. Developing an informative and implementable accountability plan, as suggested from the literature review, can help VTA with achieving program equity goals and will also enhance transparency and mitigate concerns about potential mishandling of funds that were voiced by community members during stakeholder interviews. So if I wanted to summarize this into 4 key areas, and this applies to anyone who wants to do equitable VMT mitigation, I would say that it is very important to engage the community early and often, and this is something that VTA has been very much committed to. Second, it is important to develop context-sensitive definitions and strategies. A one-size-fits-all approach does not work here. Third, it is important to test various equity indices and use different tools to see whether we will come up with similar outcomes or different outcomes. And lastly, it is important to embed equity at key decision-making points. Equity should not be something that we consider separately, but it should be at the center of everything that we do, especially as it is related to climate justice or mobility equity. Thank you so much for listening, and thank you so much the VTA team and the MTI team. To access the report, you can scan the QR code here, and this will take you to the page that the report has been published. So now let's see if you have questions.
Great. Thank you so very much, Serena. I really enjoyed listening to your presentation. Once again, I invite our guests to submit questions through the Q&A feature or in the chat. But there were some questions submitted earlier on that I wanted to touch on. And several people asked about kind of transferability, applicability in different jurisdictions. And I was listening closely, and one of the strategies that was identified for developing a framework included defining VMT equity with local relevance. And could you tell us a little bit more about what that means, what it would look like, and how you could apply that to other areas looking to implement a similar strategy?
Absolutely. Well, that's an excellent question. Well, first and foremost, I wanted to mention that defining a context-sensitive definition of equity, climate justice, mobility justice, or all these concepts that we work with is a key component of success. If we go with a wrong definition or a definition that is devoid of context, we will never reach the outcomes that we wanted in the first place. Now we have the luxury of different kinds of data sets, different indices and tools that are out there. So the first thing that we should make sure that we do is not to use any index or any tool or data set blindly and assume that it will give us the result that will reflect perfectly what the community is like, or what the needs and requirements of a particular community are. So one of the things that we did here was that we used different indices to see if similar communities would be picked up. And just the existence of these indices show that there are different perspectives, different ways of looking at equity and different ways of defining it. So we should never blindly rely on one index or tool that has been developed. We should always test and retest and try different things to ensure that we are capturing all dimensions of equity. The other aspect of this is to ensure that in our definition of equity, we are looking at all dimensions in a comprehensive way. For example, when it comes to mobility equity, it's not only about access to mobility and access to transportation choices, but it's also about pollution burden and environmental burdens. And many of these things existed for a very long time. So when we talk about equity, we have to consider all of these aspects together. And we cannot come up with a definition that reflects the reality of our own community without talking with them, without engaging the community in a meaningful way and listening to the needs and requirements of our specific community. So these are the steps that we have to take to develop a definition for equity that serves the needs of our communities.
Hey, thank you. So Mark posed a question in the chat that I think is quite interesting, because I think you probably working with the students, there were all kinds of different tools and approaches to VMT mitigation. So Mark asks, how was the use of parking management? So this idea of charging for parking or separating out parking from unbundling parking, let's say, to both discourage private vehicle use and also encouraging alternative transportation modes. Was that something that came up during the study and what the students were looking for?
Not directly, but definitely this is related to this big subject of affordable housing that was that came up many times during the interviews. So one of the things that unbundling parking does is that it separates the cost of parking from the cost of housing. One of the reasons that housing costs are very high, of course, there are many other reasons, but one of the reasons is that for a very long time, we bundled parking and the space for it with housing. So the community is definitely sensitive towards these subjects because of the tremendous need that we have for affordable housing. So that was a subject that came up a lot during the interviews. But as my mentor, Rick Wilson, would always say, parking is not something that people think about unless they're looking for one.
I love that. Rick was a truly inspirational individual planner. So I'm so glad he had an opportunity to be a mentor to you. So we had a couple of other questions submitted early on. And I know that you have done a ton of work in the area of climate action plans and climate action planning. And so again, I'm wondering about, as this research was taking place, as you and the students were looking at different solutions and approaches to creating this framework, were there any connections between the local climate action plans that have been prepared by municipalities and how your recommendations were developed for the equitable VMT framework?
Absolutely. Well, we know that transportation is the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions, and this has been an area that we have been struggling for a very long time. If you want to address the climate crisis, if you want to meet our climate goals, we cannot do it without reducing VMT and without reducing transportation emissions. So because this was a regional effort, definitely, we considered, and also VTA considered, all the efforts that were taken by local governments. Now, because of all these layers of actions, we see a lot of overlap and collaboration between different layers of government and between different groups who specifically focus on either transportation decarbonization and transportation resilience and climate action planning. And this is a good thing. This means that we have made a lot of progress since the early days of climate planning, when we did not focus on all sources of planning. For example, freight for a very long time was ignored. Now we are focusing on all of these dimensions simultaneously. So I cannot see a way that we can separate climate action planning, both local and regional, from efforts to mitigate VMT. And VTA also has a climate action plan that specifically focuses on that as well.
Yeah, if I could just very briefly, thank you. If I could just very briefly add, thank you so much for mentioning that, Dr. Alexander, that VTA actually just a couple months ago adopted our first ever agency-wide climate action and adaptation plan, which actually was funded by a previous cycle of Caltrans planning grants. And in it, we coordinated to make sure that looking at a program like this, mitigating VMT from land use projects around the county, was prioritized as one of the possible actions in that CAP. So we definitely are coordinating. And we're also, as Dr. Alexander mentioned, looking at what kinds of plans exist at our local jurisdictions as well. Thanks.
Rob. Well, I know we're just about wrapping up time, but I actually wanted a question to pose to you, Rob. So since this was this really wonderful collaboration partnership between Caltrans, VTA, and Mineta Transportation Institute, what are some of the next steps that VTA plans to take based on the framework and findings from this collaboration?
Sure. I'm happy to just talk about that very briefly. And certainly anyone, feel free to contact us offline. You can maybe, Alvarina, you could post my email address in the chat. But briefly, we are already factoring in some of the recommendations of the Mineta San Jose State project team in our community engagement. We have the second phase going on right now. Some of the meetings have been listed in the chat, and we will be doing a third phase of engagement early in the fall with the actual overall recommendations of the project. So we're factoring in some of the recommendations about who to reach out to, ways to get the word out, and ways to be considering equity in the engagement approach. We also are thinking about, when you look at the structure of a possible program that might be developed here, how do you build in that accountability framework that came out in the stakeholder interviews that the students conducted, where people said, this sounds like a good idea, but we want to make sure that, there'd be some appropriate oversight, that the funds are used appropriately and equity is considered. So that's one of the really important things that the project team is thinking about. But lots of good information that we're incorporating into the team's thinking.
Thank you so much, Rob. And it is 12:30, and I want to be respectful of everyone's time. There were a ton of questions we didn't quite get to, but I'd certainly like to thank Dr. Alexander for joining us today. As we noted, the final report is available on the website, and we've also posted a link into the chat. There's also links for upcoming VTA workshops, and we've got Rob's email in the chat if anyone wants to follow up directly with him, and we can also connect folks with Dr. Alexander if they have some additional follow-up questions. So with that, we are going to wrap up. Thank you all, and we look forward to seeing many of you at future MTI Research Snaps webinar. Thank you, and have a great rest of your day.